Hello, everybody, and welcome to NCFS Unbound, the book series formerly known as NCFS in Captivity. I am very excited to introduce our guest today, Kari Weil, who is University Professor of Letters at Wesleyan University and an affiliate with the College of the Environment and Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies. She is the author of our subject today, Precarious Partners, Horses and Their Humans in 19th Century France, which came out with the University of Chicago in 2020, as well as Thinking Animals, Why Animal Studies Now from Columbia in 2012, and Androgyny and the Denial of Difference from 1992. She's also the author of numerous essays dealing with human-animal relations, feminist theory, literary representations of animal otherness, and gender. Her current research looks at the legacies of animal magnetism in 19th and 20th century theories. And she will be interviewed today by Cheryl Krieger, who is Associate Professor of French at the University of Virginia. Her book publications include The Art of Procrastination, Baudelaire's Poetry in Prose from 2007, Approaches to Teaching Baudelaire's L'Esprit de Paris, from 2017, and Perspectives on Teaching Language and Content from 2020, and a forthcoming book on the intertwining cultures of literature and perfume in 19th century France, with the tantalizing title, at least for now, Sillage, Perfume in the Air and on the Page in 19th century France. So I am going to happily hand over the conversation to them.
So thank you, Rachel. Am I supposed to start by giving a little background? So it's interesting that can everybody hear? Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned, Cheryl's book on perfume, because one of the first things that got me interested in this topic was, I think it was Alain Corbin who talked about the prevalence of the smell of horse manure in the 19th century that was everywhere. Which made me think, okay, horses might be a potential subject. But this is actually a book that grew out of my first book on androgyny, in the sense that I kept coming across women who, that book was sort of androgyny in the Platonic sense, going to Balzac's Seraphita, but also characters who cross-dressed, who presented gender fluidity and so on. And I kept coming across women who were cross-dressing in order to ride astride, or in other words, straddle their horses, both of which were illegal. That's to say, straddling was illegal. Wearing pants, which was necessary for straddling, was also illegal. And I started getting excited by these women and wondering why they were doing this and what riding meant to them. I am a writer, have been my whole life. So it started with questions in a way of extension of questions of gender, and gender extending to the eroticism of riding, leading up to Freud saying that horses are always a matter of penis envy, which I didn't want to believe. But then I realized at the moment that the horse was sort of the most popular animal, a prized pet, we might say, prized possession in many ways, was also the very moment when horse meat was legalized for human consumption. And so I became fascinated by this seeming contradiction or confusion, wondering how can something we so prize and stroke and love also be something we eat. That got me into not just horses as the symbolic value of horses, but also trying to understand the very conflicted relations that humans had with the horse. And those were the various questions, the intersections of horses with questions of class, questions of race and breed, and questions of gender, and of course of sex and eroticism. So that's, I guess, that's it. So chapters cover various questions of eating, riding, working with horses, and issues that follow from that, both symbolic and real. Because in many senses, the horse I see as a partner in creating, or in partner for which Paris became the capital of the 19th century, which I don't think could have happened without horses. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Cheryl.
There we go. Thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this book with Kari. The book, and if you haven't seen the cover, here it is. It's a fantastic image, which Kari analyzes. It's written with such elegance and fluidity. There's this graceful integration of great works of Western thought with literary passages and newspaper articles, cartoons, caricatures, writings by public figures of all kinds. And the overarching thesis that really fascinated me, and I'm going to quote you, is that horses came to represent the social and cultural changes taking place during the century following the revolution, and that as social boundaries became increasingly fluid, the horse represents both what was lost and what was gained. And Kari shows this in so many ways, sort of bridging philosophical thought, biological inquiry, the fin de siècle physical fitness craze, our evolving understanding of pity and empathy and affect. You have such a strong, welcoming narrative voice, and the prose is crisp and knowledgeable, and sometimes it made me want to cry, and sometimes I was laughing. So the topic is spellbinding. If you care about 19th century French history, art, literature, if you want to know about animals and their relationships to humans, if you want to know what Kari means by putting Descartes before the horse, or if you want to understand the social and animal implications.
The other way around.
Putting
the horse before Descartes, but that's okay.
The horse before Descartes, yes. Yes, and the implications of the hippodrama, or how Stormy Daniels relates to 19th century horses, you have to read this book. So I wanted to, I have several questions, but I thought I might just start with the first chapter where you talk about Géricault's paintings of horses. And you say that what's singular in his paintings of horses is not the way they look, but that they do look, and look in a way that seems to defy our capacity to develop a singular world picture. So his equestrian paintings sort of mark a change in that artistic genre, but also in the way that humans are thinking about dominion over animals. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Thank you. First, thank you so much, Cheryl, for such kind words. And thank you for doing this. And I forgot to say my thank yous, and thank you to Rachel and the gang for organizing this, but especially for those really kind words, Cheryl. So yeah, so Géricault, I mean, I suppose I think of Géricault as something of a transitional figure from what we might understand as Enlightenment picturing, in which to picture is to know. And we see this in the sort of illustrations in Buffon and illustrations in many of the taxonomies that are happening. But illustrations especially in which animals do not move. They are defined by their sort of static shape, their anatomy, things that we can scientifically imitate and or draw and claim to calculate and know. And there's a change. Stubbs will be part of this change in England, but in France, I see Géricault, that for whom the horse is anything but static, but rather they, as you said, they look, they have expression, they have emotion, they have feeling, and they look in ways that we might not be able to fathom. And I think I open, or at least at one point, I deliberately contrast Géricault's horse and rider with David's Napoleon on horseback, or Napoleon crossing the Alps, in which we see, I mean, Napoleon wanted to be on a horse that was fier et fougueux, wild and fiery, and but that he could tame and dominate. And in that image, we see the horse. Yes, there we go. We have the contrast. So we have on my left anyway, we have Napoleon pointing his sword forward, the horse going forward, the two of them in tandem moving in the same direction. And with Jericho, we have horse and rider looking opposite directions, the rider looking like he's about to be consumed by his hat, about to fall off his horse. And rather than pointing his sword in the direction of history, as even Hegel would say, that Napoleon was man on horseback leading history. Instead, for Jericho, the sword is pointing at the horse's rear, at the horse's hind. And we don't know, is this forward, backward? Are we in support of the war? Where is the war? And what are their expressions? The horse seems to be expressing as much fear and confusion as the rider. So I use that to talk about, this also goes back to a break with Descartes, for whom animals did not have emotions, but also try to explain the relevance for the painting of history, in that this is, we don't know, as I said, whether if this is success or capitulation, and this. So there's that, the importance for the painting of history. There's another image where we have a soldier in his armor, bright-faced, armor covered, and a horse's head in the shadow right next to him. Mm-hmm. And you barely see the horse, but you wonder, what is this armor covering? What is this armor disguising? And the horse representing some sort of vulnerable, secretive partner. And it's, again, is the horse knowing something that we don't? And that is the horse somehow open to the secrets of the soldier that his armor otherwise disguises and keeps private.
Wow.
So I guess that's
the evolution of those images is just fascinating, and what they reveal about different ways that humans see their relationship to horses, and the agency horses might have, and the sentience, which kind of makes me want to get back to that horse meat topic you mentioned in your introduction. Yeah. So I'm one of those Americans that you mentioned who was just shocked the first time I saw a horse meat butcher shop, and then saw horse meat served at the cafeteria at the university, nicely labeled, no secrets, but you point out that there was a concerted effort to promote the eating of horse meat in the 19th century, which was news to me. I've always assumed it was some old inherited tradition that just didn't go away quickly enough. And it's so interesting how it happened, but also as you put it, that arguments for eating the meat rely on acknowledging the horse's suffering. And I just found that fascinating. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, it is. So some of this has to do, and I know at the NCF conference, there was a paper that had to deal with, where questions came up about this sort of hypocrisy of the SPA, this is the Society for the Protection of Animals. Many in that society would also be meat eaters. But the ways in which horse meat was promoted, there were a number of issues. Of course, one of it was just carcasses were all over the city. I mean, there were so many People are wondering, what do we do with this? Let's not make it, we shouldn't let it go to waste. At the same time was a new discovery of protein, and the importance of protein for skilled labor or labor of any sort. And so ideas started forming about, well, if we need protein and beef is too expensive for the working class, maybe they should be eating horse. We should have horse for the working class. Of course, here we have, separate but not equal. And there's another part of the story to that. But just getting back to the contradiction that you brought up, people would begin to say, well, yes, if we legalized horse meat, well, then the horses would be kept in much better shape up until the moment of slaughter, because no one would want to slaughter. They'd get more meat for their money if they kept them in good shape up until the moment of slaughter. They wouldn't be carried across the country and worked until they could barely stand anymore. So that was one question. If we eat them, we'll keep them better, and we'll treat them better as they are alive. Of course, their lives would probably be cut in half as well, but that wasn't part of the issue. So yeah, and I mean, it was interesting. Most of us, I was fascinated by the fact that one of the people who was promoting horse meat was Parent du Châtelet, who most of us know as somebody who was, examining prostitution in the city, and sexual manners for sexual hygiene. Of course, what he discovered was that prostitutes had been eating horse meat with no ill effects. So that was one of the ways, that he could say, well, it must be healthy. Of course, then there's the irony that at the end, before it was legalized, and it was legalized the very same year as, Ada Menken, who I talk about, that she became the hit of Paris on her horse. It was also, in order to legalize it, they had these gastronomic it was almost dinners in which, the most, the highest up in gastronomy, but also politicians and anybody could write about it in the paper would be able to taste these incredible menus in which everything was made with horse meat or horse bouillon and so on and so forth, so that they could claim that it was, horse was at the gastronomic level of the rest of French cuisine. So it was a difficult chapter to write for somebody who loves horses like I do, but it has its, and certainly in some ways one of the most contradictory chapters. In terms of this affection that turns to food and eating and meat.
There are so many contradictions that you point out that have to do with attitudes about the animal, the horse, attitudes about horse meat itself, and then the kind of symbolic value of horses, which goes in all different directions. And I was thinking about the how your research kind of grew out of your research on gender and on alterity, and queerness is something that you also talk about in the book. And I'm wondering about how gender and sex and depictions of horses in the 19th century, how they somehow express fear in some cases and embrace otherness in other cases.
Yeah. And as I think I said, that's something that took me to this project in the first place. In some ways, Ada Menken was one of the first characters that I followed. She was an American. She was a Jew. She was an actress. She came to Paris. Well, she went first to England and then as an actress, and became the hit of the stage, playing a role similar to Mazeppa, who was a Ukrainian soldier who had an illicit affair, and as punishment was strapped naked on the back of a horse. So in a similar role, Ada Menken was strapped naked, not naked, but looking naked. She was in a kind of leotard on a horse and set across the stage in 1866. And everybody was enamored of her. But the way she appeared in the press was as this denaturalized, woman who was sort of bestialized and orientalized at the same time, and whose love for her horses was especially frightening and othering. So this was a kind of queer intimacy. It's similar to one that Donna Haraway has spoken about now with her dogs, but a kind of queer intimacy between women and the horse that also bestialized the woman, and was both attractive and frightening. But from Ada, I moved to other ways. I suppose there were, for me, ways in which, in different chapters, in which the horse was one way to sort of denaturalize expressions of affection, but also expressions of gender, and sometimes a way to disguise or cover it up. So for Mencken, it was a way to, in a sense, change the nature of what it meant to be a woman, and what women could do and what women could love. And she's represented sometimes as a centaur as well. Besides Mencken, I also go, for instance, to Rosa Bonheur, who, of course, was known as somebody who rode astride, who sometimes would share her saddle with her woman lover, and create also a different, we would say queer lesbian woman, in conjunction with her horseback riding, and the virilization of horseback riding was something that was frightening to those around. Many sort of medical doctors and saying, we're warning of the virilization of women who would ride astride, Rosa Bonheur being one of them. And of course, Georges Sand's character, Lélia, not Lélia, Gabrielle, in a dialogic play, she is somebody she's a he, sometimes she's fluid gender, and just rides better than any of the men, who are interested in her. And again, this frightening sort of proof that the effort to change the way women's love and gender expression is seen. The last chapter in the book, I look at the aristocratic circus, a way in which men attempted to bring back, to the virilization that women were stealing from them in some regard. But this bringing back was also at the same time and surreptitiously bringing a new role of the male object of the gaze into. So, I have, I think, one image of Tiso, this acrobat. He's not on horseback, but he's part of this aristocratic circus in which men would be on horseback, but also on the trapeze and showing their bodies. But often showing them, it was a circus that was just for men. So, and only eventually did they start to bring women into the circus. Here, the women are there, but originally the circus had only men. And so it was men as object of the gaze. And so I use various theories of sort of, the sort of male gaze and carnivalization to allow for a male object of the erotic male gaze in that chapter. So that's some of the ways. I'm sure there are probably other other aspects of that queerness that I'm forgetting about right now. But and it moves into, as I said, this idea of queer intimacies. It's not just queer between human genders, but in queer ecologies today, one talks about queer interspecies intimacies, and that was also promoted and used as a slap in the face against some of these characters by the press and by those around. Yeah.
I think particularly those images of women as centaurs. The Tiso painting you have where they almost look like mermaids.
Yeah.
Kind of blending with the horse.
Yeah.
They're really disquieting.
Yeah. And those women are almost sort of static. They're lifeless.
Yes.
Almost as this is what will happen to you. And of course, there was the slippery slope of, you start with this and then you will become some beast, some other, if you continue this kind of behavior, was the warning.
Yeah. Well, you also talk about the other side of the coin, and that's sort of the pity, the history of pity and of empathy.
Yeah.
And how these attitudes are sort of expressed, these emotions and attitudes are expressed in text about animals and horses. And I wanted to read a quote, something you say about Flaubert that made me really look at Flaubert differently. And that is, you say, this is in chapter 2, and what we find is evidence for the ways pity as an immediate sharing of suffering was set in opposition to thought and rational intention, and so discounted as having a positive role in politics, art, or literature. This is exemplified in the works of Flaubert, where the natural feelings of Catherine Leroux for her cows in Madame Bovary, a character we don't really think about that much, or Félicité for her parrots and a simple heart, two women whose work ethic far exceeds their intellect, take the brunt of this modernist irony. In these women, we see the distance that mid-century French realism has traveled from sentimentalism, as they also expose the way animal sympathy, especially from women, could be and was exploited. I found this passage so powerful because your words kind of cut through Flaubert's irony very neatly and make us read certain passages of Flaubert, made me read these passages quite differently. It's as if we peel back the layers of narrative veiling and the animals in Flaubert's works are looking at us. And I've always also been kind of struck by Emma Bovary's repetition of where are the horses, where are the horses? Where are the horses? And I never knew what to do with that during that seduction scene in the forest. And I'm wondering if there is any relationship between Emma Bovary and other animal lovers in Flaubert, or if perhaps she's in a different category altogether.
Well, I'll go back to the pity, just as a lead up. So I do distinguish or trace a distinction between sort of pity as we see in Rousseau as what is shared by animals and what even in Enlightenment encyclopedias was promoted as sort of the most noble human sentiment. But Rousseau would say it's something that even animals share and that there is a sort of natural sentiment of sympathy that can be shared with other creatures. I see that sentiment slowly becoming, as one might say today, sort of capitalized upon in literal ways, so that what becomes humane is good for the market. I think that's something that I see in the the discours of when Catherine Leroux gets the prize and they're, praising the workers for all that they're doing. But the workers and the horse, and the meat and everything else are sort of discounted, or they're praised in order to give praise to the system and not really see the work for the value it has. So, it's the exploitation of people like Catherine Leroux. But that, whether Catherine is like Emma, I wouldn't say so. And I think because I don't see Emma as a good worker. And as you know, one of the proofs of her not being a good worker is the fact that even when she's knitting, she's always getting pricked instead of doing it well. She doesn't, right? She doesn't have a worker's fingers and a worker's skin. In fact, I might say that she might be more like a horse than she is caring for a horse. We don't really see Emma caring for much of anybody or anything, maybe her dog briefly. And if I say she's like a horse, I think, and you know it, going back to my recent interest in touch and so on, she's like a horse in that she reminds me of what an animal trainer once said, Vicky Hearn, who's also a philosopher and poet, said, every touch is like a symphony to a horse. And I feel that for Emma, every touch is like a symphony. It's one that sets her off and she wants to find it again, but she doesn't have the capacity to make anything productive or anything artistic like Flaubert, anything to rediscover what it is in that touch that made her excited. And that's part of her downfall. But I'd say her, she needs to, and she does eventually sort of begin to construct that thick skin that might protect her from, like the armor of Géricault's, carabinier, to protect from the touch and the vulnerability of others around.
Wow, that's fascinating about about touch, the horse, and Emma Bovary.
I hadn't thought of it, but your question made me.
Really, yeah, I definitely see it. And I'm thinking now about that you actually know quite a bit about horses. This hasn't come up yet, but in the acknowledgements, you talk about your own becoming with horses. And I was wondering if your own experience, to what extent your own experience with horses, first of all, what it is, and to what extent it kind of informed this research, and if your research changed anything about your relationship with horses, or about how you think about horses and live with horses.
Yeah, well, my daughter would say my horses are my therapy, and if I haven't been riding enough, don't talk to me. I certainly much of what I've been, much of my work has made me rethink some of what I do, what's ethical, what isn't. And if I put this book away for a while, which I did for many, many years, I had started it long ago and then put it away because I was asked the question, well, isn't a bit like shackles? And aren't you just, a slaveholder when you ride a horse? And so I said, okay, I've got to stop this and rethink what it is I do. And I've tried to come to, maybe it's a false justification for riding, for the bit as my weakness, my need to give the horse a pencil so that I can understand the horse. But I suppose more in line with some of what I've done in this book, and especially maybe at the very end when I talk about Delacroix's horses as witness, I often now try to think, what are horses today seeing in their, horses today, the horse world today is so different in many ways. There wasn't we don't live with horses the way we did in the 19th century. But I wonder, what do they see that I don't see? What is the horse witness to? And I suppose I ask that question also because I know, even though the horse world now seems so much more privileged, we might say, that privilege is also and continues to be a means of hiding all kinds of abuses, whether it's, the racetracks and drugging, or, other bad racetracks. I mean, just all kinds of abuse, especially by those who don't have to go near the horse because they're owning the horse and they have somebody else, abuse of the horse and of the workers who work with horses. So, I mean, I suppose I question what the horse is witnessing, and I try to question what it is, what is the horse is telling me when I'm riding? How do I read their skin? Thinking of Emma Bovary, I mean, is trying to listen to what their skin is saying and to what their ears are saying. And I could go on, but, I don't want to use up the attention.
It's fascinating. Melanie Conroy has said in the comments that she doesn't pay enough attention to horses, and she's fascinated. And I feel that way too. I feel that I'm an animal lover, and I pay attention to dogs. And suddenly I just realized I need to pay more attention to horses, although I have noticed the kind of abuses you've talked about. Definitely. And Melanie Hawthorne has asked, has the work of Temple Grandin been helpful at all in thinking like a horse?
It's a wonderful question. I do have a kind of chapter on Temple Grandin in my last book. Because precisely in the ways that she talks about our ability to screen out what we don't want to see, unlike whether people with autism or certain animals who don't have the possibility of screening out, and who maybe like Emma haven't learned, they're so much more vulnerable to all kinds of stimuli coming from the outside. And I mean, I think that's something that's quite interesting from Temple Grandin and the ways that she talks about that, but also, just her sensitivity to all kinds of stimuli that we take for granted.
That brings me to a question you ask in your last chapter. You think about reframing certain questions that other thinkers about animals and humans have asked, and you propose this question that you would ask of a horse: can I engage your interest and affection in ways that will do justice to them? How did you come up with that question, and how do you ask that question?
Oh boy, I don't know if I have a good answer for it. I mean, I came up with the question because it was sort of in conversation, not literally, but reading Dominique Lestel, who is a contemporary philosopher, ethologist, who raised the question, who in discussing the ways in which we examine animals or try to learn about them, the tradition was, don't interfere with their lives, don't perturb them, so that we can see their natural ways. And Dominique Lestel is saying, but their natural way is to be perturbed and to be attuned to us and to be changed by us. He's talking about sort of coevolution, and rather than, that organisms evolve in coevolution with other organisms. So he says, we shouldn't try not to perturb them, but ask, why are they so perturbed by us? And so I just wanted to slightly change his question and say, well, yes, that's important, but shouldn't we also ask, what is it that you want from me? And how can this has gotten me into a whole new field of biosemiotics, which is how skin communicates with skin, how bodies communicate, how can I read the body in ways that might, how can I read the body and translate it into my words and, and understand it? How can I do that? So I don't have a good question of what the answer is, but I'm much more attuned to trying and reading the horse's body in ways that maybe I wasn't before.
Oh, thank you. We have a bunch of questions flowing in on horseback. Corey Cropper asks, the mythology of the bicycle claims that early versions were invented to work around the shortage of horses in the wake of Krakatoa's eruption and the subsequent famine. And sorry, I'm not reading it very well. And when velocipede became popular in the 1860s, Parisian supporters argued that they would be much better than horses. Detractors suggested that humans would become beasts of burden like horses if they rode cycles. Are there any thoughts on the connection between horses and bicycles, or horses and machines?
I know there is. I mean, I mentioned fears about the end of the horse. There was a La Fin du Cheval. It was I think it was a book or a pamphlet that was talked about, and talking about the replacement by cars and bicycles. It's been so long since I read that. I don't remember exactly what the I think people were advocating this. The one thing I remember about the bicycle is that women needed a new outfit to ride a bicycle. They could not ride a bicycle side saddle. And so that became, so women had to get special dispensation to, I remember hearing, I think long ago at an NCFS, I think it was, when the first culotte was invented so that women could ride a bicycle. But that, because it spread legs, was considered risque. So that's what has remained with me in terms of the fear of the bicycle and the car, but also that, yes, it would mean the end of the horse and what that might.
You could always make dinner, apparently, from the horse. And Mary Harper is asking if you see kind of a development in the changing portraits of horses or paintings that include images of horses. Is there more focus on the head, the eyes, engaging with the viewer, etc.?
Well, interesting question. In a sense, with Géricault, I saw the opposite, and I found this scary. I mean, as if he was it was a premonition of the capitalization. I mean, the ways in which horses would become capital. So his paintings of jockeys towards the end of his career were sort of, I mean, there was no individuality. There was no, no individuality of the horse. And that I found so different, for instance, from his Head of a White Horse earlier on, which is such a, I mean, there is the horse as the individual, the love object, sweeping, the sweeping bangs. And also, and I remember thinking about this, absolutely vertical. The head is absolutely vertical, in contradistinction to growing phrenological ideas of the sort of chin, the nose, the further out the chin or the nose is, the more degenerate the face, moving into racist hierarchies. But the horse was absolutely vertical. So with him, I saw the opposite, and and more so. I mean, Rosa Bonheur brings that expression back, I would think. I think there we see the expressiveness, and expression as productive, more productive than in Géricault, where it's frightening.
Thank you. M.A. Boutin also has a question. Are some 19th century French writers more sensitive to horses, horse lovers than others? Or were horses so much part of the 19th century that they were everywhere? And also, are British writers more sensitive to horses than French writers?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. I don't know about what our British, I mean, yes, there's always this contest between the British. I mean, there was, contest between the ways the British rode and the ways the French rode, between Le Comte d'Or and Baucher. There were two completely different schools of riding, and different, people would argue differently which was better and which was better for the horse and so on. I think there's, if I had to argue, I mean, the British never ate horse. So that might be one proof of a concern for the horse as a subject. I would say, though, the fascination, the sort of love, fear of horses persists throughout the 19th century. I mean, to Zola, I mean, in
Germinal.
I mean, and Germinal especially. I mean, it is the death of the horses in Germinal.
Yeah.
Is the most powerful, sad moment I feel like in all of Germinal. I mean, it's just, and their friendship is the most, we might say, human and most positive of any friendship during the 19th century that I could see, between Trumpet and who's the other one? Now I can't remember the other.
I forgot the name.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the other horse's name, but it'll come to me as soon as I'm.
And I wonder, so the example you talked about quite a bit from Sue, which is a horse being beaten, in a way that also seems like evidence, the fact that the scene is there is sort of evidence of some compassion.
Yeah, I mean, it's in Hugo. It's I mean, this the question of the beating of the horse. I mean, this is in my chapter on pity and horse beatings and what to do about it. But also, well, if we are too concerned about the beatings of horses, that might, as we see, lead to sort of class. The dangerous workers who are the ones who are beating them. And, so Marx was very concerned that we not care too much about the beating of horses and SPA and so on.
Bill Paulson wants to know if you found any parallels between eating horse and eating dog, the latter associated with 1870 but there are so many other associations with dogs and horses too that you mentioned. Just in the fact that we can kind of love them, but they've worked for us very hard.
Yeah. I mean, certainly much of the discourse around the eating of horse and the legalization in the 1860s there was the slippery slope that if we start with horse, we will then get to dog, we will then get to other creatures and family members and so on and so forth. So it's part of the slippery slope. But yeah, I mean, certainly the SPA, I mean, dogs would be the sort of objects for vivisection, and the problems of vivisection in science, in a way that horses were maybe less so at the end of the century, but sort of taking their place in that regard.
Corey has another question, and he says it's his most important question. Do you know the real origin of the expression merde? Oops, the screen just flipped. As in break a leg. I have heard it comes from the amount of merde that horses left in front of the theaters during the performance.
Oh, I'll have to check. I had no idea.
Okay, let's see. And maybe combined with that and May's question, says Elizabeth Emery, Does this interest love split on urban rural lines? Oh, this interest love of horses, does it split? This is not the question about Merrill that Corey asked. Does it split on urban rural lines? Okay, I'll stop there. She goes.
Okay. Well, it's a good question, and since most of the texts that I found are urban, I'm not sure if I have, it's hard to find the I didn't come across enough literature outside of Paris in a way to I mean, some is set outside of Paris, obviously, but the writers are mostly Parisian.
I'm wrong. She was thinking about Corey's question about Merde, and she's asking, Elizabeth says, I'm thinking of an urbanite like Huysmans, for example, who is fascinated by horses in the circus, but maybe not in town.
Oh.
And she asked another question just above, I think, about the circus.
But the circus was in town.
So
I mean, I
circus,
guess
yeah, the circus is kind of a different, when you consider the viewers as city viewers going to the circus, it really is a different interaction with the horse.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the whole history of the circus and the growth of the écuyère and the écuyer, I mean, and the changing, I mean, it's one of the things I loosely look at, but the changing dynamics of the circus from haute école dressage in the beginning of the century to acrobatics at the end of the century, and where we get the Tiso, in which it's much less about the sort of training of the horse than of using the horse as a platform to show off bodies, human bodies, and what they can.
Yeah.
So the horse becomes a very different kind of figure at the end of the century, or towards the end of the century in that regard. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Does it, Elizabeth? I think we're getting very close to 3 o'clock, and what we could do is open up the room, get our MC Rachel back.
Hi.
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 Hi. We see
Hi.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Great. So yeah, we will officially thank you guys, because we know some people have to leave right at the hour mark, but thank you for that fascinating discussion. And if anyone wants to stick around and we can find out if Elizabeth's question was answered to her satisfaction. But you're welcome to turn your cameras on and unmute yourselves, and we can chat more informally for as long as people would like to stick around.
Thanks so much, Kari. And
well, thank you, Cheryl. I love the stickies.
this is how I read.
Yeah. No, thank you for your wonderful questions.